He said the voices told him to do it, but the voices were his own. And by the time police caught him, 14 women were already gone. But this wasn't the work of just any man. It was the work of a man who believed he was doing God's bidding. A man whose twisted mind turned a house in Philadelphia into the prison of his nightmares. This is the story of Gary Michael Heidnik, a man who kidnapped, tortured, and murdered with terrifying precision. A monster masquerading as an ordinary man, hiding in plain sight. In the early 1980s, Philadelphia was known for its rich history, its culture, and its vibrant neighborhoods. But behind the facade of bustling streets and family homes, something much darker was lurking. The first victim, a 25-year-old woman named Josefina Rivera, had no idea she was about to fall into the hands of a man who would strip her of her freedom, her dignity, and her life. She was a mother of two, with a kind smile and a hopeful heart. Josefina had been struggling with the hardship of being a single mother. On March 19, 1987, she was walking down the streets of North Philadelphia when a man approached her. Offering her what seemed like a chance to escape her struggles, he promised her a job. She never made it home. Josefina would later reveal that Heidnik's twisted game had begun long before the first woman disappeared. He had a plan, a brutal, chilling plan that would unfold over the course of months. Soon, others followed. In a matter of months, the city would become the site of a horrific pattern, a pattern that no one could have imagined, and one that no one was prepared for. Each victim seemed to vanish without a trace. At first, they were thought to be runaway women, perhaps lost in the chaos of their lives, perhaps seeking a better future. But that was far from the truth. There was no escape. Heidnik had a plan, and it involved controlling his victims like puppets, locking them in his house of horrors hidden from the world. And each time, the story was the same. A woman was lured in, trapped, tortured, and then disappeared from the world. They were nurses, mothers, students, and they all vanished within a 20-mile radius of the same highway. Heidnik's victims were not just numbers, they were real people, with real lives, mothers, daughters, sisters, each with their own dreams, their own hopes for the future, and Heidnik took that from them. Their names would become mere echoes in a city that would eventually be haunted by the knowledge of what happened behind the doors of Gary Heidnik's house, a house of horrors where evil walked freely. The disappearances began to raise questions, but it wasn't until the pattern became undeniable that the authorities began to take notice. At first, the missing persons reports were dismissed as routine. It was easy to believe these women were just victims of the streets, wandering off in search of a better life, perhaps running from someone or someone. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence grew louder. There was one particular case, though, that forced the police to reevaluate their assumptions. Josefina Rivera, the first victim, had managed to escape. After enduring unimaginable torment at Heidnik's hands, she found a way to break free. Her escape wasn't just an act of survival, it became the key that would unravel the horror Heidnik had hidden behind closed doors. When Josefina stumbled into the hands of law enforcement, covered in bruises and barely able to speak, she was a walking testimony to the nightmare that had unfolded inside Gary Heidnik's house. In a broken voice, she told them everything: the kidnapping, the torture, and the imprisonment. She described the dungeon-like basement where she and the other women were held captive. She spoke of the dark, suffocating space where Heidnik would torment them for days on end. The police had their first real lead, but it was hard to believe that someone like Heidnik could exist among them, hiding in plain sight. As authorities began their investigation, they quickly realized that the story was far more complicated than they had anticipated. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Heidnik wasn't just some random predator. He had been preparing for this for years. He had set up his own private hell, and the women he captured were only the beginning. What the authorities didn't know was that Heidnik had already committed these horrific acts for months, if not longer. The trail was cold, but they had no choice but to follow it. He had already shown his ability to blend in with his community, going unnoticed by those around him. A quiet, unassuming man by day, Heidnik's true nature was revealed only through the horror he inflicted behind closed doors. The investigation took a dark turn as the police uncovered his past, a history of mental illness, manipulation, and a disturbing fixation on power. They found evidence of his disturbing fantasies, but none of it could have prepared them for the full extent of his depravity. The search for the remaining women intensified, and as the investigation progressed, the police began to uncover the gruesome truth. Heidnik had been living a double life, hiding behind the facade of an ordinary man. By the time they searched his home, the full scale of his crimes became apparent. The basement was a literal tomb, evidence of pain, suffering, and terror at every turn. And yet, the real horror had yet to be fully revealed. Gary Michael Heidnik was not the man he appeared to be. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet mechanic, a man who kept to himself. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Philadelphia, blending in effortlessly with the community. He didn't stand out in any way, no loud behavior, no overt signs of violence. But behind his unassuming facade lay a darkness so deep that even the most seasoned detectives would struggle to understand it. Heidnik's childhood was marked by instability and emotional trauma. Born in 1943 in Ohio, he was the son of a domineering mother and an absent father. His relationship with his mother was particularly strained. She was cold, emotionally abusive, and often rejected him, causing a deep sense of inadequacy that Heidnik would carry with him throughout his life. He was raised in an environment where love and affection were foreign concepts. This neglect shaped the man he would become, someone who believed that control and dominance were the only ways to earn value in the world. As Heidnik grew older, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He served briefly in the military, but his time in the army was marked by complaints of mental instability and violence. He was discharged, and from that point on, his life took a dark turn. Heidnik began to experiment with drugs, including LSD and other hallucinogens, which further exacerbated his growing paranoia and delusions. He started to see women not as individuals, but as objects, tools to control, manipulate, and ultimately dominate. Heidnik's descent into madness didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process. He moved to Philadelphia in the early 1970s and started a modest chain of fast food restaurants. It wasn't a grand success, but it was enough to support his increasingly disturbing habits. He had a series of failed relationships with women, many of whom described him as controlling, cruel, and volatile. Heidnik's interactions with women were marked by manipulation. He would often use money, promises of jobs, or offers of affection to lure them into his world. But once they were within his grasp, he would change, revealing a cruel and monstrous side that terrified his victims. By the time he began his killing spree in the late 1980s, Heidnik had already honed his skills in manipulation. He didn't just abduct women, he trapped them in his house, held them captive, and subjected them to unspeakable acts of torture. His victims were often starved, beaten, and mentally tormented. He forced them to endure physical and psychological abuse, all while maintaining a facade of normalcy to the outside world. What made Heidnik even more chilling was his ability to compartmentalize his life. He could interact with neighbors and coworkers, all while hiding the horror he was inflicting in his own home. He was living a double life, and no one suspected a thing.
He was a master of deception, carefully crafting an image of a harmless, if slightly eccentric man. But behind this carefully constructed mask lay a monster, and it wasn't until Josefina Rivera escaped that the truth would finally come to light.
Heidnik's ability to maintain his outward persona of normalcy, even as he committed unspeakable crimes, is what makes his case so terrifying. He wasn't a madman ranting in the streets. He was calculated, patient, and methodical in his pursuit of power over his victims. His neighbors never suspected the horrors lurking behind the door of his house, and for years, Heidnik's monstrous actions remained hidden in plain sight. Gary Heidnik's method was one of eerie precision and chilling consistency. His actions were not random, they followed a pattern, one that showed the growing escalation of his violence and his desperate need for control. His victims were all women, vulnerable, often struggling with their own hardships, making them easy targets for his manipulations. Heidnik didn't just kill, he tortured, humiliated, and broke them down mentally before taking their lives. Many of his victims were down on their luck, often involved in prostitution or drug abuse. They saw in Heidnik a potential savior, a chance for escape, a way out of their grim realities. Once they were in his clutches, there was no escape. Heidnik's house became a prison for these women, a place of unspeakable horror. He kept them locked in a dark, grimy basement that had been turned into a makeshift dungeon. The room was barren except for a few blankets, chains, and the tools Heidnik would use to inflict pain. It wasn't just the physical abuse that tormented his victims, it was the psychological torture that broke them down. Heidnik would isolate them from the outside world, forcing them to depend on him for food, water, and basic human needs. He made them believe they were completely at his mercy. The cruelty didn't end with confinement. Heidnik would subject his victims to a variety of torturous acts. He would starve them, beat them, and deprive them of sleep. He often used psychological tactics, telling them that they were worthless, that they were nothing but objects to be used at his will. He even went so far as to force some of the women to take part in disturbing games, humiliating them for his own twisted pleasure. The most haunting aspect of Heidnik's method was the way he would escalate his actions over time. The more he tortured, the more he needed to control. He would show no remorse for his actions, only a growing satisfaction in his ability to dominate and destroy. His attacks were calculated, each one more brutal than the last. At one point, he went so far as to starve one of his victims to the point of near death, only to revive her with water and food just to begin the cycle of torment again. Heidnik's preferred method of control was not just in his actions, but in the power he sought to exert over his victims. His method of control was methodical. He would break them physically, strip away their dignity, and leave them psychologically shattered. The violence didn't stop at physical abuse. Heidnik made sure to mentally and emotionally destroy his victims, pushing them to the brink of madness. He'd threaten to kill them if they didn't comply with his demands, and yet, many times, he seemed to derive more pleasure from their broken spirits than from the actual physical violence. What made Heidnik especially terrifying was his ability to lure his victims in with promises of safety, only to trap them in an unthinkable nightmare. He would move from one woman to the next, perfecting his method with each new victim. He knew how to push their buttons, how to manipulate their fears and desires. Heidnik wasn't just a man who killed, he was a man who lived for the power he wielded over those he controlled. By the time his killing spree escalated, he had perfected his methods. The horrifying act of murder wasn't just an end for Heidnik, it was a part of his twisted process. And each time, the brutality increased. He seemed to enjoy the suffering, basking in the terror of his victims as they realized they would never escape. His ultimate goal was not simply to kill, but to make them wish they were dead long before they met their end. The investigation into Gary Heidnik's crimes began only after his first victim, Josefina Rivera, managed to escape. Her courage would prove to be the key that opened the door to one of the most disturbing serial killer cases in American history. But even with her testimony, the road to uncovering the full extent of Heidnik's crimes was far from easy. The investigation was plagued by dead ends, false leads, and the sheer difficulty of believing that such a man existed in their midst. When Josefina first walked into a police station, barely able to speak and covered in bruises, the officers on duty didn't immediately understand the gravity of her story. She was a young woman strung out on drugs, and the police initially thought her claims might be the result of her chaotic life. But she was insistent. She had escaped from a man's house, a house filled with terror and suffering. She told them about the dungeon-like basement, the chains, and the horrifying things Heidnik had done to her and the other women. Her escape was a miracle, but it was also the beginning of an investigation that would unravel the shocking truth. At first, the detectives struggled to piece together the details of her story. Heidnik was a master of deception, and his house had been a well-hidden prison. When the police arrived at his home, they had no idea what they would find. The house itself seemed ordinary, a typical working-class home in a quiet neighborhood, which made it all the more chilling. They had no idea they were standing at the entrance of a house where unimaginable horrors had occurred for months, if not years. The initial search turned up little, but as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Heidnik had a pattern. His victims weren't random. They were all women who had been vulnerable in some way. Young women, often down on their luck, looking for an escape. This realization led the investigators to widen their scope, uncovering more cases of missing women, some of whom had been reported as runaways and others who had simply vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came when the police were able to connect the dots between Heidnik's past and his crimes. They found evidence that Heidnik had been involved in a series of disturbing incidents before the kidnapping and torture of his victims. He had been charged with minor offenses, but those charges had never been followed up with any serious investigation. His history of violence, though scattered and overlooked, was now seen as a warning sign that had been ignored for far too long. But the most significant turning point came when police discovered the tools Heidnik had used to control his victims. They found chains, ropes, and disturbing records of the abuse he had inflicted. Surveillance footage also revealed that Heidnik had been keeping his victims under lock and key for months, even years in some cases. The full extent of his depravity became painfully clear. The pieces began to fall into place, and the authorities realized they were dealing with a man who had methodically and cruelly executed his plan. The media began to pick up on the case, and soon the investigation was receiving national attention. As detectives delved deeper into Heidnik's past, they uncovered a disturbing truth. Heidnik had a long history of mental illness, and his crimes seemed to be part of a twisted fantasy in which he sought complete dominance over his victims. But no one could have predicted the depth of his pathology. Even his closest friends and associates were shocked when they learned the truth. How could this quiet, unassuming man have committed such horrors? The investigation continued, but every step forward seemed to reveal something even more shocking. It was a race against time to uncover the truth, and as the authorities closed in on Heidnik, it became clear that they were dealing with a man who was not just a killer, but a calculated, methodical predator who had spent years perfecting his ability to evade capture. Gary Heidnik's capture came on March 24, 1987, after Josefina Rivera's escape and subsequent revelations. The police, armed with her testimony, raided Heidnik's home, and what they discovered was far worse than they had imagined. The house, which seemed so ordinary from the outside, was a house of horrors. Inside, authorities found the remnants of his twisted acts, chains, ropes, and other tools of torture. The dungeon-like basement where Heidnik had been imprisoned and tormented his victims was a chilling testament to his monstrous methods.
Heidnik was arrested without incident. When questioned, he showed little to no emotion, almost as if he didn't understand the gravity of his actions. His cold, detached demeanor only added to the horror of his crimes. As the investigation progressed, the full extent of his depravity became apparent. Heidnik's trial began in 1988, and it quickly captivated the public's attention. He was charged with 2 murders and the kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault of multiple women. His defense was based on his mental instability, but even then, Heidnik's lack of remorse made it difficult to sympathize with him. In 1988, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Despite appeals, Heidnik was executed by lethal injection in 1999, ending the reign of terror he had imposed on his victims. The aftermath of Gary Heidnik's crimes left lasting scars on the city of Philadelphia and the families of his victims. His house of horrors, once a place of terror, became a grim symbol of the darkness lurking in an ordinary neighborhood. The women who survived Heidnik's hellish captivity faced years of emotional and physical recovery, with many struggling to rebuild their lives after such profound trauma. Heidnik's execution in 1999 didn't bring closure to all, as the pain of the suffering endured by the victims remained. His case also raised disturbing questions about the flaws in the mental health system, particularly in how Heidnik was able to manipulate the system for years. His trial, as well as his crimes, forced authorities to reassess how serial killers could hide in plain sight. The case sparked numerous documentaries, books, and media coverage, ensuring that the horrors Heidnik inflicted would never be forgotten. His victims, however, are remembered for their strength and survival. If you found this story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, what are your thoughts on the case? How do you think Heidnik managed to hide his monstrous behavior for so long?
Hospitals are supposed to be safe, a place for healing, a place where families find hope, not heartbreak. But for over 16 years, something was wrong, something no one saw coming. Patients who were stable began crashing. Cardiac arrests came out of nowhere. Lab reports didn't match symptoms. And yet shift after shift, he was there. Silent, professional, invisible. Charles Edmund Cullen was a registered nurse. Trusted, unassuming. He moved between hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, always just one transfer ahead of suspicion. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, he had already killed again, and again, and again. As we delve into this video, don't forget to like this video, share with friends, and subscribe to Murder Files for more delve into true crime cases. Before understanding the man behind the murders, you have to know who he took. These weren't just names on a chart. They were parents, grandparents, sisters, brothers, people who were loved, people who were supposed to get better. Charles Cullen began his nursing career in 1987 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. His first confirmed kill came a year later, a retired judge recovering from an illness. The man wasn't expected to die. In fact, he was doing better. But then, without warning, his heart gave out. Nobody questioned it at the time. Death was always a possibility in hospitals. That's how Cullen continued. Between 1988 and 2003, he worked at 9 different hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. At each one, patients began dying unexpectedly. Some were seriously ill, others were on the verge of discharge. One was a young woman recovering from a car accident. Another, an elderly man expected to go home that weekend. Then there was the cancer patient who had made it through treatment, only to die suddenly overnight. There was no pattern in who he chose, old, young, male, female, terminal or not. The only consistent detail was that Cullen had access to their medication, and after he walked out of the room, they were dead. He often used drugs like digoxin, insulin, or epinephrine, administered in doses so high they caused the heart to stop almost instantly. These drugs were recorded in the system, but because they were common medications, they didn't raise red flags until later. Staff at some hospitals noticed odd behavior. Patients coded more often when Cullen was working. Sometimes he would be found in rooms he wasn't assigned to.
At one hospital, another nurse caught him entering a patient's room with a syringe in hand, despite that patient being on palliative care with no orders for intervention. But nothing ever stuck. He would resign, transfer, or quietly disappear before formal complaints could catch up to him. Families never got answers. Some were told their loved ones simply passed in their sleep. Others suspected something was off, but hospitals insisted there was no foul play. It wasn't until years later, when law enforcement looked back at medical records and drug logs, that a pattern became horrifyingly clear. By then, Cullen had moved again, and the deaths kept following him. For years, Charles Cullen slipped through the cracks. Hospitals saw him come and go, often leaving behind a string of patient deaths, yet no one raised the alarm, not loudly enough. It wasn't until his final job at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, that the truth began to surface. In 2002, Cullen joined the staff at Somerset, bringing with him the same quiet demeanor and clinical efficiency that had helped him blend in for so long. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but within months, the hospital began noticing a strange trend, an uptick in codes, medical emergencies where patients' hearts suddenly stopped, often during Cullen's night shifts. In some cases, the patients weren't even in critical condition. Pharmacists flagged medication requests. Cullen was accessing drugs that didn't match his assigned patient's needs. He was withdrawing digoxin, used for heart conditions, in amounts that didn't make sense. Nurses began whispering. Doctors noticed the spike in unexpected deaths. Something wasn't right. One patient, Reverend Florian Gall, came in for a relatively routine stay. He wasn't expected to die, but shortly after Cullen was seen near his room, Gall coded. Later, a toxicology report revealed a fatal dose of digoxin in his system, far beyond what would ever be prescribed.
That one case sparked questions. Internal reports started piling up. The pharmacy reviewed Cullen's access logs. Why was he withdrawing so much insulin? Why was he logging into the Pyxis machine under other nurses' accounts? In October 2003, the hospital finally contacted the New Jersey Poison Control Center, which in turn contacted the Department of Health. But even then, things moved slowly. Somerset administrators hesitated to take direct action. Cullen continued working for another month, even after suspicions about drug overdoses were voiced in writing. It was a mistake that gave them what they needed. In one incident, Cullen administered a medication to a patient that was never prescribed. The patient survived, but when the chart was reviewed, the medication order was missing. It was the first undeniable proof that he was giving out drugs on his own. The hospital placed Cullen under surveillance. They compared shifts, drug logs, and incident reports. The same pattern repeated over and over. Whenever Cullen worked nights, patient emergencies increased. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a method. By December, authorities had enough to move in. They brought Cullen in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, calm, blank-faced, and cold. But within hours, the cracks began to show. He had done this before. He'd gotten away with it for years. But this time, someone was finally paying attention. It was a young nurse and a pair of determined pharmacists who made the breakthrough. If they hadn't spoken up, Cullen might have walked again, right into another hospital, right into another job, right into another set of lives to destroy. What had started as quiet suspicion was now an open investigation, and the story was just beginning to unravel. Charles Edmund Cullen didn't look like a killer. He was quiet, awkward, and rarely made eye contact. Colleagues called him strange, but never dangerous. He kept to himself, followed protocol, and avoided confrontation. But behind that quiet demeanor was a man carrying decades of darkness.
Born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, Cullen's early life was marked by pain and instability. His father died when Charles was just 7 months old. By the time he was 17, his mother had also passed away in a car crash. Her death, he later said, shattered him. Left alone and spiraling, he dropped out of school and attempted suicide for the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Before becoming a nurse, Cullen served briefly in the U.S. Navy, but his erratic behavior led to a discharge. At one point, he was found sitting silently in a missile control room with a surgical mask on for no reason. Other times, he sabotaged equipment on purpose. After leaving the military, he entered nursing school, where he seemed to find purpose, but not peace. Throughout his adult life, Cullen attempted suicide more than 20 times. He was treated at psychiatric facilities and prescribed medications, but nothing seemed to stick. He got married, had 2 daughters, and then the marriage fell apart. His wife filed multiple restraining orders. She claimed he had spiked people's drinks, abused pets, and left syringes lying around the house. To neighbors and co-workers, he was just odd, socially off. But none of them knew about the private war inside him, or the way he believed he was saving patients by ending their lives. He didn't kill for rage. He wasn't driven by revenge. He killed to feel control. Control he had lost long ago. Charles Cullen didn't stab or strangle. He didn't hide bodies in basements or leave notes behind. He used syringes, small, silent, and deadly. And he did it where no one would expect, in plain sight, in hospital beds, surrounded by trust. His method was subtle, almost surgical. He selected patients who couldn't fight back, often elderly, recovering from surgery, or too ill to protest. Sometimes they weren't even his assigned patients. He would roam from room to room, carrying vials of digoxin, insulin, or epinephrine, medications that, in the right doses, saved lives. But in Cullen's hands, they became tools of death. Digoxin, a heart medication, was his favorite. In small doses, it strengthens the heartbeat. In large doses, it stops the heart altogether. Cullen would administer it quietly, often without a written order. Insulin caused blood sugar to crash rapidly, leading to seizures and death. Epinephrine could cause fatal arrhythmias. Each death looked like a medical event, sudden, tragic, but not suspicious.
He was meticulous. After administering the drugs, he would return to the nurse's station, document what needed to be documented, and go about his shift as though nothing had happened. In many cases, no autopsy was ordered. The patient was presumed to have died naturally, until the numbers started stacking up. The killings escalated over time. At first he was careful, killing a few patients a year, but by the early 2000s the pace quickened. At Somerset alone, it's believed he may have killed as many as 13 patients in just 1 year. He grew bolder, more reckless. Some think he wanted to be caught. Others believe he simply didn't care anymore. Whatever the reason, his method never changed. Clean, clinical, and chillingly efficient. He wasn't just playing God, he was perfecting it. By late 2003, the whispers about Charles Cullen had turned into full-blown suspicion. At Somerset Medical Center, the pharmacy team noticed a disturbing pattern. Patients were dying after receiving medications they were never prescribed, and the orders, almost always, could be traced back to Cullen. Still, hard evidence was elusive. Hospital leadership was cautious. Fear of lawsuits, public backlash, and reputation damage kept administrators silent. Some even discouraged deeper digging. But 2 staff members, Nurse Amy Logren and a persistent pharmacist, refused to back down.
Amy, who had worked closely with Cullen, was shocked when police approached her. At first, she didn't believe it, but when they showed her the Pyxis records, logins, drug withdrawals, and timestamps, her doubt turned to horror. She had unknowingly stood beside a killer for months. Police needed more. They asked Amy to wear a wire. In a series of secretly recorded conversations, she coaxed Cullen into talking. He didn't admit guilt outright, but his words were full of strange, evasive phrases. He spoke of patients not needing to suffer, of fixing things quietly. Every conversation built a clearer picture of intent and gave investigators the leverage they needed. They also analyzed the hospital's digital records. Cullen had been accessing drugs he had no reason to use. In many cases, the patients didn't even require those medications. Charts were altered, entries disappeared. Some medications were signed out under other nurses' credentials, suggesting he was covering his tracks. When police finally arrested him on December 12, 2003, he showed little emotion. At first, he denied everything, but within hours, he began to talk, and once he started talking, he didn't stop. He confessed to dozens of murders, names, dates, drugs. Some investigators had to leave the room. They weren't just hunting a criminal, they were trying to calculate a body count. Charles Cullen was arrested on December 12, 2003 in a restaurant parking lot in New Jersey. He didn't resist. No chase, no violence, just silence. When detectives sat him down and started asking questions, he said one sentence that chilled them. "I did it to end their suffering." Then he started talking. In 2 days of interviews, he confessed to 30 murders across 10 different hospitals. The investigators were stunned, not just by the number, but by the calm way he described it all. He named victims, he listed the drugs, he remembered details no one else could. Some of those cases had never even been classified as suspicious. But even then, detectives believed he wasn't telling them everything. In fact, Cullen later admitted that he had no idea how many people he had killed. Estimates today range as high as 400. That would make him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. As news broke, public reaction was explosive. Families demanded answers. Hospitals scrambled to review their records. Reporters flooded courtrooms. Cullen's face appeared on every channel. Yet during his arraignment and hearings, he rarely spoke, except once. At his sentencing in 2006, as the judge read off the charges, 29 confirmed murders, 6 attempted, Cullen sat still. When victims' families gave their statements, some in tears, he didn't flinch. But when asked if he had anything to say, he whispered a phrase again and again. "Your Honor, you need to step down. You need to step down. You need to step down." He was later diagnosed with major depressive disorder, personality disorder, and suicidal ideation. But psychiatric evaluations found him competent to stand trial. He received 11 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole. The courtroom was silent as the gavel dropped. He had killed for nearly 2 decades. Now, finally, he would never walk free again.
Charles Cullen will spend the rest of his life behind bars at New Jersey State Prison. No chance of parole, no appeals, no freedom. But for the families he shattered, that sentence wasn't closure. It was the beginning of a lifelong ache. In the months following his arrest, hospitals across the Northeast faced mounting pressure. Civil lawsuits poured in. Internal investigations exposed systemic failures, missed warning signs, ignored staff concerns, and records that showed Cullen's deadly pattern stretching back over a decade. Administrators had repeatedly chosen silence over scrutiny. Some hospitals quietly fired him. Others gave neutral references just to make him leave. He kept getting hired. Patients kept dying.
the healthcare industry was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. There was no centralized tracking for nurses suspected of wrongdoing. Cullen's case triggered nationwide reforms. New Jersey passed legislation tightening reporting procedures for healthcare workers. Some hospitals upgraded their drug monitoring systems and revamped whistleblower protections. Still, the damage was done. Families of the victims formed support networks. They shared stories, photos, grief. Many said they never suspected foul play. Their loved ones had gone in for manageable conditions, surgery recovery, dehydration, pneumonia, and never came home. Books, documentaries, and interviews tried to piece together the full story, but even now, no one knows how many lives Cullen took, not even Cullen himself. Some bodies were cremated before tests could be done. Others were never exhumed. The number might stay a mystery forever. For those who survived or lost someone they loved, Cullen became a symbol of betrayal, a man who exploited trust, used his position to kill, and smiled through it all. He claimed he wanted to stop suffering, but the pain he left behind never healed. If this story shocked you, share it. These victims deserve to be remembered, and the systems that failed them need to be held accountable. Subscribe for more true crime stories that go beyond headlines and into the truths hidden behind them.
He said the diary spoke of ravaging women across Cleveland, Rochester, even London, but California was where he struck bloodiest. By the time police broke into his Reno home in April 2010, Joseph Naso, a 76-year-old retired photographer, already held a ledger listing 10 women, maps, and a secret list of 10 detailing his crimes. And then came the chilling twist. 4 of them shared the same initials, all strangled. Among the first to vanish was Roxane Rogash, 18, last seen near Oakland. Her naked body was found in January 1977 on a hillside outside Fairfax. She had been strangled less than 24 hours before discovery. A year later, Carmen Lorraine Colon, 22, disappeared while on her way to work. Her body turned up near the Carquinez Scenic Highway in August 1978, just miles from Roxane's dump site. Then came a long silence. For over a decade, there were no known connections. But in 1993, the pattern reignited. Pamela Parsons, 38, a waitress in Yuba City, vanished. Her body was later discovered off a rural road, strangled and posed. Just a year later, Tracy Lynn McKinney Tafoya, 31, was found near a cemetery, drugged, strangled, and left in a chillingly staged position. All 4 women had something disturbingly in common: double initials, RR, CC, PP, TT. They were all vulnerable, many had histories of sex work, and each was discarded in remote parts of Northern California. None of them were treated as priorities at first. But this pattern, eerily precise, cruelly consistent, would later be impossible to ignore. Roxane had dreams of art school. Carmen was trying to turn her life around. Pamela supported her children. Tracy wanted to start over. They were real women with real stories, long before their lives were reduced to initials in a killer's notebook. It began with a probation check in April 2010. Joseph Naso, then 76, was already on probation for petty theft. Officers arrived at his home in Reno, Nevada, expecting little more than routine documentation. What they found instead was a cache of evidence that would send shockwaves through law enforcement across 2 states. Inside his cluttered home, investigators uncovered something deeply unsettling: a handwritten list.
titled simply Girl Number 1, Girl Number 2, and so on. The document detailed 10 cryptic descriptions, each hinting at a woman's location, age, or appearance. Some included cities. Others contained chilling phrases like girl from Port Costa and girl near graveyard. Though the names weren't written outright, each line felt like a breadcrumb to buried secrets. Alongside the list were hundreds of photographs. Some were clearly taken without consent, women in lingerie, unconscious or appearing lifeless. Dozens of journals documented disturbing fantasies and movements. These were not the harmless ramblings of an old man. This was methodical, intentional, predatory. At first, local officers weren't certain what they were seeing, but when they matched phrases from Naso's list to cold cases in California like Pamela Parsons and Tracy Tafoya, the realization hit hard. This wasn't just a man with dark fantasies. This was a man who had acted on them for decades. Then came the twist. The double initial victims, Roxine Ragash, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya, all corresponded with entries on the list, 4 of 10. And suddenly, a pattern once dismissed as coincidence now screamed of premeditation. News broke, investigators scrambled, and California authorities reopened long-forgotten files. The question was no longer whether Naso had killed. The question was, how many had he truly hunted, and how long had he been hiding in plain sight? To neighbors in Reno, Joseph Naso was a quiet old man, a bit odd maybe, but harmless. He had once been a freelance photographer, known to drift through town snapping pictures of women. Some thought he was eccentric, no one thought he was a serial killer. But behind the camera lens, Naso hid something far darker than artistic ambition. Born in Rochester, New York in 1934, Joseph Naso's early life was largely unremarkable. There's no public record of severe childhood abuse or trauma. He served in the military, married, had a son, and lived a relatively stable life on the surface. But cracks in the facade began to show. He developed an obsession with control, especially over women. His wife divorced him. His behavior grew erratic.
During the 1970s through the 1990s, Naso traveled extensively across California and the Northwest. His work allowed him freedom, mobility, and cover. He often posed as a professional photographer, offering modeling opportunities to vulnerable women. Some accepted. Others were watched from a distance. All were disposable in his mind. He documented everything: his movements, his fantasies, even his victims. His journals read like confessionals, but without remorse. He referred to women as targets. He wrote of drugging them, posing them, taking trophy shots. The photographs found in his home weren't art, they were souvenirs. And yet, through all this, Naso managed to blend in. No arrests for violence, no neighbors calling the police. Just a quiet man in khakis, pushing 80, still jogging daily, still smiling at the grocery clerk. It wasn't until his list surfaced that the truth clawed its way into the open. The man who seemed invisible had, for decades, orchestrated murders with patience and precision. And the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. Naso wasn't just hiding in plain sight, he was performing. Joseph Naso didn't kill in frenzy, he killed with calculation. Each murder carried a signature that, at first glance, felt almost forgettable. No blood-soaked scenes, no theatrical staging. But when examined closely, a chilling pattern emerged. His victims weren't just murdered. They were dominated, drugged, photographed, and positioned in ways that told a story, his story. He favored strangulation. It was personal. It took time. There were no gunshots or knives to betray him with noise or evidence. Several bodies bore signs of restraint. Some showed evidence of being posed after death, and others were found in carefully chosen remote areas, always near roads he knew well. Photographs found in his home showed women in unnatural poses. Many appeared unconscious, some confirmed to be deceased. He arranged their limbs, changed their clothes, and captured the final moments of control. To Naso, the camera wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon, a way to immortalize his dominance. What made him even harder to catch was his restraint. Unlike many serial killers who escalate quickly, Naso operated in waves, years between murders, decades even. The gaps gave him cover. Victims were spread across counties, different jurisdictions. No one connected Roxine in 1977 to Pamela in 1993 until that list appeared. One of the most unsettling aspects was the eerily orderliness of it all. He kept ledgers, notes, a master document listing women not by name but by coded references, dates, locations, and traits. The now infamous list of 10 matched at least 4 confirmed murder victims. As each entry on that list was decoded, a fuller picture came into view. These weren't isolated killings, they were part of a pattern, a ritual carried out over decades, and yet no one noticed, no one stopped him, until he made one mistake. For decades, Joseph Naso slipped through the cracks. Cold cases were shelved, detectives transferred, and victims forgotten. Until 2010, when a simple probation check changed everything. When investigators found the list of 10 in Naso's Reno home, they knew they had something serious. But lists aren't convictions. They needed proof, hard forensic evidence to tie these cryptic entries to real crimes. California authorities reopened old files, particularly in Marin, Contra Costa, and Yuba counties. The forensic team began analyzing decades-old evidence, reviewing autopsy photos, and tracking down witnesses who had long since moved on. The challenge? Time had buried most of the clues. DNA degradation, lost records, faded memories. But one piece still held power: Naso's own documentation. He'd kept everything. Detailed journals mapped out his travels, preferences, and fantasies, many aligning with the locations and timelines of known murders. And then came the break. A photograph of a woman found in his house was positively identified as Pamela Parsons, one of the double initial victims. From that point, the dominoes began to fall. More connections surfaced. Witnesses recalled seeing him with Tracy Tafoya shortly before her disappearance. Fingerprints matched objects near one victim's remains. And in one chilling twist, a receipt found in his home placed him at a location within hours of a body being discovered. Detectives also uncovered undeveloped film rolls, some of which contained disturbing images. They were grainy, time-worn, but damning. One image showed a woman bound in a position identical to a victim's found body. The poses weren't coincidence, they were blueprints.
Despite Naso's age and attempts to play innocent, the evidence mounted, and when forensic analysts linked him definitively to 4 of the women on his list, the decision was clear. It was time to move in. On April 11, 2011, Joseph Naso was arrested in Reno, Nevada. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in him. An old man, quiet, invisible. But the charges were anything but small. 4 counts of first-degree murder, each tied to women on his handwritten list. The media caught wind of the arrest quickly. Headlines exploded across California. Double initial killer caught. Photographer charged in cold case murders. It had taken decades, but justice had finally arrived. As the trial approached, the courtroom braced for something unique. Naso, ever controlling, insisted on representing himself. He was confident, calm, even smug during hearings. He questioned witnesses, examined evidence, and attempted to twist facts in his favor.
But what he couldn't hide was the mountain of documentation stacked against him. Prosecutors presented the list of 10 photographs and journals. They detailed how each victim was stalked, murdered, and discarded. Forensic experts testified to the DNA links. Victim families sat in the courtroom, some breaking down as graphic images were shown. Others held hands, waiting for a moment of reckoning. The most haunting moment came when the prosecution played the 911 call from Pamela Parsons' friend who had reported her missing. Her voice cracked with panic. In the gallery, silence fell like a stone. Psychiatrists examined Naso, labeling him narcissistic, delusional, obsessed with domination, but not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, every step of the way. After weeks of testimony and chilling exhibits, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. The jury did not hesitate, and on November 22, 2013, Joseph Naso was sentenced to death. He showed no emotion. With the verdict delivered and Joseph Naso sentenced to death, the court adjourned, but the weight of his crimes lingered long after the gavel fell. Families of the victims, some of whom had waited over 30 years for justice, found little comfort in the outcome. For them, the verdict wasn't closure, it was confirmation of a horror they had suspected but never fully understood. Naso was transferred to San Quentin State Prison in California, where he remains on death row. He spends his days in isolation, still defiant, still denying full responsibility. He's filed appeals, blaming the media, the jury, the system, but never himself. For the investigators who worked the case, the trial marked one of the most bizarre and complex manhunts of their careers. Detectives involved admitted that without the 2010 probation search, Naso likely would have died a free man. It wasn't brilliant sleuthing or a dramatic confession. It was paperwork and persistence that cracked the case open. The ripple effects went beyond a single courtroom. Cold case units across California began reevaluating their files, especially cases involving sex workers or women found posed in remote areas. New attention was paid to victim patterns, especially those previously dismissed as random or unrelated. But perhaps the most enduring impact of Naso's crimes was the spotlight it placed on forgotten women. His victims had been overlooked for years, dismissed because of lifestyle, class, or circumstance. Their murders were brushed aside. Only when a killer bragged about them did they get headlines. Books, documentaries, and podcasts now tell their stories, not just Naso's. Their names, Roxine, Carmen, Pamela, Tracy, are no longer just initials in a notebook. They are women with histories, families, and unfinished lives. Joseph Naso is behind bars, but the shadows he casts stretch far beyond the prison walls. His crimes raise unsettling questions that still haunt investigators and families alike. How many killers like him are still walking free, quiet, unassuming, hiding in plain sight? How many women's stories remain buried, dismissed, or ignored because of who they were or how they lived? And what would have happened if one routine probation check hadn't exposed the truth? If this story disturbed you, moved you, or opened your eyes to the dangers that lurk beneath the surface, don't look away. Subscribe to this channel for more gripping true crime documentaries every week. We uncover the stories others forgot, the victims that deserve a voice, and the truths that still need telling. Tap the bell so you never miss an upload. And let us know in the comments, do you believe there are still names on Naso's list we haven't uncovered? Stay curious, stay vigilant, and most of all, stay human.